Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
Welcome one and all to the Defiant Takes Football Show. I'm Max Dean. You can find me on Twitter at @TheMaxDean, and I am here with Nick Merriam, our Director of Draft Content and Scouting. You can find him on Twitter at @NickWithSports. So today we have a slightly varied show for those of you who are watching live. Our thumbnail and title are perhaps slightly misleading, so we are going to eliminate the positional value conversation from the show today. We're going to go for about an hour instead, and we're going to talk about the top linebacker prospects in the draft, and we're also going to have Sam Goodman from Defiant Takes Football joining us to talk about spring football, to talk about the XFL, the USFL, and what's going on with those leagues right now. So I'm just swapping things up slightly, and we'll be back with linebackers next week at some point. Nick, how you doing today, man?
Doing pretty good. Just doing what we've been doing, continuing.
So it's linebacker Thursday. Got a number of guys we want to talk about. It's the off-ball linebacker, of course. And this is interesting because there's kind of a reflection of positional value here in the fact that not only is it a position that is sort of less important in the NFL than it was for the majority of its existence, it's kind of reflected in the way that we're talking about it as well. We don't have this long list of prospects that we want to go over. These guys are probably not going to get drafted as highly as some of the other positions, and they just don't get paid as much for the most part either. And a lot of the big contracts, they don't necessarily work out. They don't get a lot of money in free agency. This is just a group that, along with the running backs, that have seen a loss of value more than any other position. So, before we kind of dive into that, why don't we talk about that specifically? Why do you think that the linebacker position in particular just doesn't carry the same weight that it once did?
Well, it's a really strange position group because the market value of linebacker is still pretty competitive. And a lot of that is because the crossover in terms of like the way the NFL defines these positions of like outside linebacker, which is actually just edge players getting paid, affects the markets of inside linebackers. So TJ Watt like brings up the like franchise tag for off-ball linebackers, which has had like the strange effect where you do see like a lot of linebackers in free agency get paid like not a whole lot when they're like solid players, but when you have a high end like Fred Warner or Roquan Smith, they get like we're now seeing them touch into like the 20 millions, which has not quite happened with, some of the other lesser positions yet in the NFL. The guard market, I guess, just hit 20 million with Lindstrom, but I don't know if Nelson had done that before, but
he had just cleared it.
Yeah. So it's a strange one in that I don't think I would even, this position is probably less valuable than guard at this point. And it's still being kind of propped up by the blurred lines of edge players being off-ball outside linebackers, right? Now, for real, though, like in terms of just what's going on in the field, I think the problem is you're finding more and more athletic types who can be safeties, like big nickel types, Kyle Hamilton types who can cover and run, but then can fill in the box and tackle. I mean, there's guys like Cam Curl who are like 210 pounds, not like big, who can make that happen. You don't need a 260-pound linebacker anymore because the game is moving at a different speed, right? And I think the adjustment we're seeing is we're going to see more tackles like Orlando Brown, Dawan Jones, who, aren't maybe impeccable athletes, but are just massive and can push guys around. And as that occurs, you'll probably see it come back slowly. But as of now, like this is a game that is more built around faster, more nimble athletes. And because of that, you don't really want the 260-pound linebacker who runs a 4.8 anymore, even if they have great instincts and are strong as an ox.
Yeah. I mean, it's just different. You just need guys who can function well in coverage. You just need guys that can't get easily burned by these slot receivers or running backs or tight ends who have a lot of ability in the passing game. And it's tough to find a guy who has the requisite size to be both an impact player in the run game. You can find guys who are viable that are a little bit smaller, but to be an impact player in the run game, and also be athletic enough to be impact and coverage, right? Because one of the big things that makes a star player at any position is his ability to do everything necessary at a very high level. And with the linebacker group now, it's just we're getting more specialized in any one direction, and we're also leaning towards coverage in general. But that also might mean that you can fit the run, but you're not making splash plays in the run, right? You're not forcing fumbles necessarily. So it's just it's a position where we just don't have a body type that for the most part can impact the game in a number of different ways. And I think that's kind of the same thing with running back at this point too. We've got these pass catching guys who can extend their career, but they don't necessarily bruise guys. They don't knock them back. You know what I mean? They're not breaking tackles by hitting you head on. And so those guys have longer careers, but the guys that do impact the game like that, the Derrick Henrys, they don't necessarily have a long career, right? He's extended his a little bit because he didn't play a ton early in Tennessee, but I think that we're kind of seeing that his, I don't want to, assume a guy's career is on the downswing already, but I think the reality is that that's just what we can come to expect with that position. So, and linebacker is similar. So let's get into it.
And I should say really quick, this is just very fast, that I look at the linebacker position philosophically as the opposite of safeties, where safeties, you have a baseline of coverage you need to be good at to make it in the league. And if you can blitz and fit the run, like that's the bonus that can make you a Jamal Adams or Kyle Hamilton. When you're a linebacker, you do have to baseline be a box player, like blitz, fit. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to play linebacker. Coverage is what gets you drafted highly. Otherwise, you're just another kind of box guy who might, see play as like base packages, and you probably go later, like day 3-ish.
Yeah, absolutely true. So let's get into your guys here. We're going to go from 1 to 5, and then we can talk about some of your honorable mentions as well. But your very first linebacker, your number one guy, is Jack Campbell. So what is it about Jack Campbell that makes him your top prospect?
Well, he tested really well. He's the best coverage linebacker in this draft class. And I should say, this is a 6'4", 5'8", 250-pound linebacker who can cover, and he's a Mike. And there's not many Mikes in this draft class that are going to be at the top of the board here. So this is very valuable. You don't really see many coverage Mikes in the NFL this year or at all. And he has that ability. I was not as high on him when I first watched him because he, quite frankly, going into hits is a little bit soft. This is not a guy that's going to be pummeling opponents over and over and over again. But what I will say is he's a very smart, instinctive player. He often gets the right gap. He often gets the right spots. And when he does have to run and hit, he's better at that than maybe filling a gap and knocking a running back. But I will say when he does have to fit a gap, he does his job. It's just not maybe the physical, battering in that gap that people have come to expect from a middle linebacker. He's more, I think, intuitive in the way he plays and just physical. That being said, he has the tools on top of that. And I think because of the coverage first that he kind of plays with, and I think that baseline of just knowing what to do in the run game, he's going to be valued higher in this draft than I think people are giving him credit. I think he ends up being the first linebacker off the board because I think there's just a lack of Mikes in general in the NFL. You see all these wills coming, guys who can play off basically safeties, right? But they're just better in the box playing linebacker. This is the guy that can play, C to C gap, call your plays, all Big Ten academic guy. And I think he just kind of fits the bill of what we've seen from Mike linebackers in the NFL that have succeeded.
And I should clarify that he is out of Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
So he's a Big Ten linebacker. And so if you had to predict exactly where he were drafted, and then of course, where would you draft him if you were given the opportunity?
Yeah, so I might have a mock-up tomorrow. And I have him going 34th to Texans at the beginning of the first round because I think that fit would be awesome just with what's his name, D'Amico Ryans being the head coach there, looking for another linebacker next to Christian Harris who can play the Mike spot more, as Harris is more of kind of a floating blitzing linebacker off the edge a little bit. And I think that'd be an awesome fit. And I think that's about where he goes. I wouldn't be shocked if he's back end first round and the Eagles or Chiefs or the Bengals are hey, let's just take a chance with this guy. But I think probably early second is where he ends up, and that's probably where I'd take him.
Yeah, I think I'll be really surprised if the Eagles use a late first round pick on him. I just think it's
I just think it's
not
as
in their
likely
nature.
as them taking a running back, and a lot of people seem to think that's the case. So,
well, we're not going to predict that here either. So, all right. So next up we have Drew Sanders. So again, what makes Drew Sanders your second rated prospect here?
So you'll see some outlets have him listed as like an edge player because we've kind of blurred like the Sam backer with that a little bit more. And that's what he is, right? He's a guy that kind of like Micah Parsons coming out, his like first trait is his ability to pass rush, right? And that's rare. You don't really see that from off-ball linebackers too much anymore. And in Parsons' case, he was so good at it that he just is a full-time edge player now. Drew Sanders is not that good. Like, he's not really that body type either. He's only 6'4", 235 pounds, but another guy who tests well, really good body control tackler, can kind of run a gaps. I have a little more concern about this guy in coverage. And I think that's kind of the gap here between Campbell and the rest of these linebackers. I should say Sanders is an SEC guy, was productive for multiple years at Arkansas. He has good length. Again, like, this is a dude that coming downhill as a pass rusher, he has the speed, but more importantly, like, when he gets, one-on-one with a running back or even like a guard, he just runs through them, right? He doesn't really hesitate about it. Like, he's just trying to knock over somebody. And that's the type of blitzer when I look for safeties and linebackers. Like, I don't want guys that are trying to make dudes miss. Like, you can do that well. I think Jamal Adams is really good at that, but it's rare. Often the best blitzers off ball are the guys who just can literally just shoot gaps downhill with impulse and just knock guys backwards into the quarterback. And he's very good at that. And you see athletic upside with him, making plays in coverage, when he gets opportunities, making, long rangy tackles. So this is a guy that I think, he's going to play more of the outside off ball position. He's not quite a Mike, but just physically, like, I think he's ready. I think he's, smart enough player to play day one in the NFL. I don't know that he's like quite on the level of Campbell in terms of coverage at all, but he's certainly ready to play in the box and impact the game that way. And we've seen guys like Nick Bolton, who are not excellent coverage players, step in and impact the defense immediately.
Yeah, that's true. So, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what else to say about this guy. I feel like, also there's not a lot of like minutia to this game either. If there's something else that you want to bring up about him, then we can. But I mean, I don't know. Maybe we just want to hit the next guy here.
He's not like a super nuanced player, the pass rushing. Yeah. And I should say, like, I think he's probably also going to end up going upper half of the second round. I have him going 41 to the Titans in my mock. So.
All right. Well, then let's go on to Henry To'oTo'o out of Alabama.
Yeah, so I think he's fallen off. I don't know if he tested as well as people were hoping. He's also just 6'1", 227 pounds, like completely undersized. We've seen guys like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah like play well at that height and weight, so I'm not ultra concerned about that, especially just kind of with the blue collar style this guy plays with. He is like has no he's no fear. Like, this guy is probably going to get injured just because he throws his body around so much. But as a pass rusher, a rangy tackler, he is just a hard worker on the field. He makes every play he can. He's a decent drop zone coverage player. I don't know that I put him in man a whole lot. I think he might be better than Drew Sanders at this point, but he's not great at that either. This is a guy that more impacts the box. And more importantly, when you really start getting these kind of like early third round linebackers, he's the best special teams linebacker in this draft class, which really is something that comes from, speed, physicality, and willingness to play on special. Like, you have to be willing to work hard on special teams. It's just it's an all out type play that you do once in a while. And he was one of the best punt return and punt team players in the country last year, which will get him drafted probably day 2. I would expect still, maybe later. I might take him like at the end of the second round if I really wanted a linebacker, but I don't think people are as high on him as I am.
So, I mean, is there anything about his game that you think could, take him to the next level and basically make him a big-time impact player?
Yeah, I mean, just like adding weight, I think he over pursues play fakes a little bit sometimes, and that's a problem with a lot of linebackers. I think in particularly could be an issue with him. But I think when he's engaged for too long, like, you can kind of see the strength, like, it being an issue for him because of his size. So hopefully, in an NFL weight room, he adds more, and even if he gets to like 235, he's a guy that would greatly improve, I think, with that weight.
And he went back to college last year. A lot of people thought that he might come out Do you think that benefited him? Do you think he's just kind of hovering around where he was last year, or
It did for
do you feel like
me. I don't know if it did for the league, because here's the thing: is some people thought this was a first-round guy last year because he was transferring from Tennessee to Alabama, and quite frankly, he didn't play well last year. And I think he was much better this season, so it should. But sometimes, kind of the hype of like transferring to Alabama and not quite being what you expect immediately hurts your draft stock. This could be a guy that goes in like the 5th round, ends up being a good player. People are like, "Well, why did he go in the 5th round?" You know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely possible. I mean, especially because of the particular style of player that you mentioned him as being. There are other guys you can always find who can kind of do that. So it's definitely possible that he falls down board. All right. So next up, you have Trenton Simpson. So what is it that puts Trenton Simpson this high on your list?
So he's also like he's 6'2", 235, same weight as Drew Sanders, but doesn't quite have the length. He doesn't look big. Like his frame is kind of thin, at least in the upper body. He's more of a box player too, which is strange again for a smaller linebacker. Like I kind of expect him to be more impactful in the pass game. And I think like PFF was high on this guy because his coverage grades weren't bad, but I think they just don't use him in coverage ever. Like that's kind of his thing. He lines up a lot, like kind of almost on ball, left and right side to blitz, or just defend outside the tackle. And he's good at that, and he can play the box as well. Like this is a guy that might have more Mike versatility than you'd expect for someone in the 230-pound range. In terms of like penetrating one gaps, which we talked about, Clemson's defense loves to do, block shedding, just his use of length and like impacting the run game. He's a really good linebacker, but I have concerns when he gets into coverage, has to drop zone, doesn't really like look for work to do in coverage. He's very much like kind of the guy that stands on grass and just sits there and hopes to take up space. He plays very upright, so there are times when he does like run into a tackle, he just gets put on his ass. And open field tackling at times, like there are like problems with that as well for him. He's a guy that like physically, like he does things right, but he just has not put his game together fully enough for me. And in terms of like a linebacker who's been in college for him, it's 3 years, but he's been playing the entire time at Clemson. And he's physically like supposed to be one of the top players in this draft. I have concerns about his development to this point, and that I don't think his ceiling's super high, and I'm not willing to take bets on linebackers with lower ceilings early in the draft.
So, we talked a little bit in the past about how Clemson defensive linemen tend to have a lot of physical tools and traits. They're a big-time recruiting program, but they're maybe not as developed as some other programs coming out. I mean, obviously it's a different position still on the defense. How do you feel about Clemson linebackers in general?
It's the same thing. I just think in this case, what we were talking about, like there are a lot of one gapping, but they freelance things when the gap is not like where the run play is going, so they can give up like cutbacks and things like that. I think with Murphy and Bresee, like Murphy last year played really well, so this year's just a down year. Bresee, it's more of like clearly had circumstances that didn't allow him to develop. In Simpson's case, I think he's gotten better, and the development. I don't know where his game expands, because I don't think as a coverage player, like I don't expect linebackers who don't both look for work in coverage and have like the type of movement that I look for, because he's very much like you see it with some players downhill, like attacking the ball, he moves faster, but then like chasing the play from the backside, it's not the same, right? And I worry that he is like a box impact only guy because of that, which makes me a little lower on him. I have more of a 3rd round grade on him. I think he's probably going to end up going higher in the 2nd round, but
yeah, it's just that's not something that a player who doesn't show it already tends to put together at a higher level of football against better athletes. It just doesn't usually happen that way. But all right, so let's touch on our 5th player here, and this is a player that we got to see at the Senior Bowl and stood out, Deion Henley. So what is it about Deion Henley's game that makes him your 5th best linebacker?
I really wanted to be super high on Henley after the Senior Bowl. I think he's awesome. And like, honestly, if I'm a Washington fan or any team needs a linebacker, like I'd rather take Henley at the end in round 3 than Simpson, but he's just like not fully ready. And the ceiling is super high with him. He's smaller again, like 6 foot, 225. The issue is like, he was a 6th-year senior. Like this guy's like pretty old, and you're like hoping he's going to learn a new position, and that's a gamble, right? And I think he's on the way with that, and I'm excited for him in terms of that. But if it doesn't work out, this is not a guy that like even if it does work out, you're expecting like a long-term second deal with, because he's already like 26 years old, 25 years old, whatever. But again, like you see it, like his motor, his trail coverage. He's a great nickel pass rusher. This is the guy that's probably closest to being a safety of all these linebackers. So he's kind of people used to say tweener is like a discredit to some of these players. I'm okay with it, because if you can play big nickel, that gives you more versatility in terms of matching up in terms of different packages on defense. But he's a little flat-footed in zone. Doesn't look like he knows what he's doing. Stop and go with instincts. Like sometimes you'll see it and then he'll commit, but sometimes he's not certain, he's not ready, he hasn't played enough yet in the thin frame. Like he gets hurt sometimes when he gets engaged with tackles because he doesn't have the strength yet. He's a project, and I think the ceiling for this guy, if it works out, is extremely high in terms of that rookie contract. But you're talking about an older developmental prospect who I think teams who are more like competing right now want this guy, and it limits him, I think, on like a board where we're trying to like make an all-encompassing board for all these teams. He doesn't really fit into the plan for a team like, the Colts who are trying to rebuild,
Right. So he's an interesting guy because when we saw him at the Senior Bowl, he clearly stood out as the best coverage player in the entire group. It was very natural for him. So I think the cool thing about him is that you see what he can do, and he just needs to be able to marry that to live football where everything else is going on around him, and he kind of because when you're in these one-on-one drills, you know who your guy is, and all you have to do is focus on what that player is doing. So if you can marry that ability into like live action, then he really can be an excellent player. I mean, his transitions, his ability to change direction, his feel for sticking in man coverage was all very impressive. I mean, I think he was one of the best players at the entire event in that regard. So, in terms of standing out as that. So, if you were to look at those skills and you figure maybe he goes somewhere that he can translate them, what do you think his upside looks like? Do you think he becomes one of the best players in the NFL at the position? Or do you think that he's still limited a little bit and will just be a really good coverage player?
I suppose his upside could be that good because you just don't really see that many like great impact linebackers. So that's what you're gambling for, right? My comp for him would be like a guy that actually reminds me a lot of is Chaz Surratt a couple of years ago, who the Jets traded picks away to the Vikings to go up get AVT for, and then the Vikings took him, and now he's on the Jets practice squad. Didn't quite work out, but he was similar. Like he was a quarterback, and then he became a linebacker like late in his college career, was an older prospect, and clearly was like very athletically gifted, but not sound as a linebacker yet, and needed to learn more. And the Vikings just like couldn't get enough out of him year one to see that development, and he's ultimately on a practice squad now. So, Deion Henley has the ability to be a practice squad player year two, and he has the ability to be a Pro Bowl player year two. And that's the difficult nature of drafting a player like that, day two-ish.
Yeah, so we're going to have Sam Goodman on here in just a sec, but let's just run through your list of honorable mentions here real quick.
And these are not guys that Williams might be my number 6, but these aren't in any particular order. They're just guys I kind of like. Dorian Williams from Tulane was just an excellent coverage linebacker last year for them, and just, maybe some more physicality concerns, although I think he ran a really good 40 time. I'd have to check on that. But, more concerns about how he fits in as a box player. But if it works out, like that's a guy that's probably gonna go 4th, 5th round. And if he hits, like he's also going to be very, very good. Otherwise, he's probably just more of a special teamer in his NFL career. Amari Burney is a really gifted athlete as well from Florida. I believe was a high recruit, never really put it together, but there are just flashes on tape of absolute brilliance in terms of like ball hawking ability this year. Like his best games, like Georgia, I think he played really well Utah. Like there are games where he literally like forces 3 turnovers, and it's like, where is this coming from? And so I just think he's an interesting development guy, again, like later day 3. And D Winters is actually like the guy I loved at the Senior Bowl. I thought he played really well for TCU this year. Probably higher floor player, more of a guy who might be able to play Mike and lock down the box as a run defender. I have a little more worry in terms of how he's as a coverage player. But if you're a team that, kind of like the Chiefs a couple of years back, I think Washington's in this area. I think the Steelers were before they signed Cole Holcomb, but like looking for just a linebacker who can defend against the run to come in on base package downs. D Winters is like a very high floor version of that. And because of that, I could see him going anywhere from like later on day 2 to like not being drafted, depending on who's looking for that type of player.
Yeah, it's pretty wild how much of a fall off there is because in the past, it was just assumed that inside linebackers weren't going to be that good in coverage, but it just was not important, and you'd still get guys drafted in the top 10
It's Kyle
who were like
Shanahan's
that.
fault. He started saying, "Let's just match up with those guys." Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and it's just the availability of those pass catching running backs too. I mean, you might have a couple of those guys coming out, but they weren't so prevalent that almost any team could pick one up, at some point in the draft and then make that a matchup problem. If you had one guy in the NFL, you weren't necessarily going to see a major defensive shift because those one or two guys, were hard to deal with because you might not even play them in a season ever. So it is interesting. We've seen one side of the ball completely impact the other in terms of what's valuable. And we see that all the time, but this might be currently the most intensely visual version of that, I guess maybe is a way to say it. All right.
By the way, Dorian Williams did run a 4.49, so he is like your undersized speedy backer here.
So he's that guy that
Yeah.
you're going to bet on. All right. So let's bring in Sam Goodman here. We are going to talk about spring football, the USFL, XFL. Sam is our lead spring football writer.
What's up,
for
guys?
XFL, USFL. Sam, how you doing, man?
Man, I'm excited. We got players officially reporting to camp, so all this stuff is starting to kick off for the USFL. The XFL's been rolling; it's doing well, so it's a lot to be happy about.
So Nick is he's a Washington guy. So he lives in Philly, but he is a Washington Commander supporter and a Washington Defender supporter. So I know that he's excited to talk about some spring football here today. But first I want to talk about kind of where these leagues are in their processes. Some people have been waiting on every drop of football news that they can, being able to watch some of these games live. Other people haven't necessarily committed to that because we've seen these leagues come and go. So if you could just give a basic rundown on these two leagues as they stand and kind of fill people in on what they are in the midst of right now.
Yeah, so because the XFL's already underway, I think we can start there. It's kind of interesting because it's the first league to be in its third variation, right? They say the XFL 3.0 because obviously, started back in 2001, failed. And then in 2020, they came back. They had the COVID year, so they had to shut down operations. And now they're back and they're in week 5 and doing really, really well. They've got some big fan bases out in DC where Nick's from, and St. Louis is thriving. And then on the other hand, you got some places that are still needing some work, like out in Vegas, they're playing on a minor league baseball field, which doesn't look too great for the sport. But it's still fun. There's a lot of big names that we can get into and all that. In terms of the USFL, players have reported to camps, and they are going to start in the second week of April is when the first game should be. And they're playing in 4 different regional hubs. It's the second year of the league, but they're in 4 different areas to go watch games: Detroit, Memphis, Birmingham, and Canton, Ohio. And so the good part about that is, more of a fan base and turnout can actually go to these games, because we saw there was one, but nobody could really make it down to Birmingham every week for their team, especially when you were in a lot of different places. So I'm excited. I think the USFL has a lot to offer. I think the XFL has shown that they, are going to be here for at least a little bit longer. And it's a lot to be excited for USFL year 2 and XFL 3.0.
So go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about what you just touched on, which is that the XFL had a year and it was kind of successful. And I feel like people sweep under the rug and are like, oh, the XFL failed twice. And it's like, well, COVID kind of killed it, right? Yeah. So from a PR perspective, it's tough to kind of give the idea that the XFL is doing really well. And then I think on top of that, I think people are scared that having 2 leagues may overlap a little bit and bring audiences away from each other. What have you kind of looked into that? Do people talk about it around the XFL coverage? What's your kind of, I don't know, just views on the whole subject with that?
Yeah, so there are two levels to that, right? So with the XFL failing, the XFL's like public relations department just doesn't talk about it. They kind of refuse to talk about the last two variations of the league. Like they say, oh yeah, it existed. There's history here, but the XFL 3.0 and onward is the continuity we want to talk about if you want to, bring it in like movie terms. And then in terms of like the USFL and XFL, they have some sort of rivalry going between the fan bases, which is really interesting to see because they're really passionate. And that's a cool thing too about these leagues, right? There's a small fan base, but they're really passionate fans and they care a lot. And so a lot of people were saying like there should be a merger there so that they can actually compete, kind of like the NFL did with the AFL for the Super Bowl, and in terms of like the business side of things, though, Fox isn't really worried when it comes to the XFL because they're in different, time slots mainly. The XFL is going to be wrapping up by the time the USFL starts, and they view it as a very different league, right? They view the XFL as almost a NFL minor league with some former players, whereas the USFL is very much branded to, okay, you didn't make it to the NFL, but we're gonna get you there. It's a developmental league, and so that kind of core difference, at least in terms of how the businesses view it, how Fox and ESPN and I guess The Rock and his crew at the XFL view it, is kind of the difference, that sets them apart. But in terms of the fan base, right, they still view it that the very similar way, and there's a pretty healthy competition going on.
So, who are some of the most notable players who are currently competing and are expected to compete?
Yeah, so right now, if you want to look at the XFL, you got St. Louis, AJ McCarron, the former Alabama star quarterback. He is starting there. He had a pretty interesting story too, turning down some backup offers in the NFL because he wanted to make memories for his kids and be able to play. And I thought that was a really cool story. He fits the city of St. Louis well, wanting to be on the football field and wanting, to, actually make some core memories in St. Louis playing football, which is cool. And they're behind the team. The team's doing well. You got Josh Gordon and Ben DiNucci out in Seattle. Josh Gordon getting a second chance to play professionally, and he's had some pretty spectacular highlight plays because he is a pretty good receiver, right? He was an all-pro before he ended up having to take a leave from the NFL. And, everyone who at least was on social media last year knew about Ben DiNucci coming in, and he has a pretty large following, and he's been fun to watch. So there are some names over there, especially on the offensive side of the ball in those skill positions. And I think like from a business standpoint, that was also a big goal. Get some names people remember and that you can kind of promote before the league takes off, because you don't know what you have until the league starts rolling. And so if you bring in some guys that maybe are going to be successful, maybe are just going to bring in some name notoriety, you already have a way to promote yourself, which is a smart way to go about it. For the USFL, it's a little different, right? Because as I said, they're using it as a way to develop college players who didn't necessarily make it. And also, a tough part of it is a lot of these players who, for example, were drafted in the USFL this year or who played last year have either hopped over to the XFL or the NFL. And the draftees, they haven't signed yet. They have to wait, obviously, for the NFL draft to see if their name gets called. So it's a tough situation to see, who's there. But in terms of coaches and some players over there that made an impact last season, Jeff Fisher, who was obviously a coach of the St. Louis Rams, LA Rams, he was the Michigan Panthers head coach last year. Now they brought in, oh God, from San Francisco, 49ers. He's always wearing a suit on the sideline, and it's a cool situation to have Mike Nolan come in, who, yeah, obviously is replacing Jeff Fisher. So they have big names on the coaching front, and then player wise, a lot of guys headed out. But last season you had Paxton Lynch, who was a former first round draft pick to the Denver Broncos. He ended up leaving for the XFL, and this season Alex Mago was a huge standout that they advertised a lot last year. Quarterback, Birmingham Stallions. There are definitely some smaller names right now in the USFL as the rosters are starting to get set, but I'm fairly certain some pretty, standout college players will join the rosters, as it's a better opportunity than sitting on the bench in the NFL or sitting on the practice squad for, the first 3 years of your career, trying to make it, get more tape, try to make a roster. And that's the important part of these leagues.
So, quick question. What are the key differences in terms of the rules from both each other and from the NFL for these leagues?
Yeah, so the XFL is really where the rules are quite different. And I think they're pretty cool. Some of them were actually rules that the NFL had proposed as a way to implement, and then they didn't uh, they didn't pass the owner vote, which is a difficult thing to do, right? The owners do like to keep the league the same way, and that's again part of the fun, of the XFL. You get to see what these experimental rules are like. So the most obvious thing would be extra points for the XFL. You have a run or pass play only after a touchdown, so you don't get to kick. But if you start at the 2-yard line, you get 1 point, 5-yard line, 2 points, and the 10-yard line, 3 points. So most of the time, you're going to see 2-point conversions, and that's not obviously common in the NFL. It's a pretty cool rule. It allows for a little bit more action. They also have 2 forward passes. So if you throw a forward pass behind the line of scrimmage and you throw it again down the field, that's legal in both leagues, which again is a pretty cool system, but it doesn't come out often, right? It's still something that teams are adjusting to in terms of coaching. And it's also, it is a fluky kind of play. So it's not like you're constantly seeing it. You're still watching football that you will recognize. So it's not, completely out of the norm. But when you see it, it's kind of like watching a flea flicker. It's pretty cool. You got onside kicks, which are different. So instead of kicking an onside kick, which you can choose to do, you can also run a 4th and 15 from your own 25-yard line. And that's only in the fourth quarter. So that's been super cool to watch, because we've seen teams, because of the extra point system and the onside kick system, make 12-point comebacks in the last 2 minutes. It's super exciting. You really never know when the game is over until the clock hits 0. So St. Louis did that to Seattle week 1, if I'm remembering correctly. And that 4th and 15 rule was actually proposed to NFL owners a couple of years ago and just didn't pass a vote. And now fans were starting to say, hey, this is a really, interesting rule, and it seems to be working well. We should maybe take a look at this. And that's, again, why spring football is super important, because it allows to demonstrate some of that versatility and, tell the NFL, hey, we can make changes. Instant replay is also pretty important, because the officiating is done mainly through instant replay. It's done through the ESPN booth and Dean Blandino. So he's constantly reviewing every play and live officiating everything. But he's got that third eye. Another thing that has been talked about for the NFL, because it kind of corrects errors on non-reviewable plays. And, it helps with a lot of those missed calls that we see, or non-calls, whatever it is. It's always designated to the officiating department up above instead of on the field for whatever that rule is. So I like that personally. And then the USFL is pretty similar. They have the extra point system where you can kick it from the 15 for 1 point, 2-point conversion, which is from the 2-yard line actually, and then a 3-point play from the 10. So a similar system, but a little different. And then onside kicks in their league, they also have that 4th and whatever play, but it's 4th and 12 from their own 33. I don't know how they came up with that, but it's just almost sounds like they want to be contrarian and say, we want to do the same thing, but a little different. They have forward passes or double forward passes. But I think their coolest thing is definitely overtime, which is a best of 3 shootout from the 2. And then after 3 possessions for each team, if that doesn't occur, then it's a sudden death shootout, which is just it's awesome. It's like watching college football, overtimes when they get way too far into it, those games that go, 3 hours long. It's super fun to watch, and especially when those players are exhausted, constantly lining up, and it gets super chaotic. They rush the field when they win. It's awesome. The atmosphere is great there too. So
that's cool. So Nick, you can talk a little bit about this from the fan perspective, right? As you kind of jumped on with the defenders here. What markets do you think are the most ready to embrace these teams? I think we've seen a little bit from Washington because the Commanders haven't been very good, and not just at that, but there's just so much going on with them that people are kind of frustrated with the team in general. St. Louis obviously lost their team, so they're kind of ready. But where else would you say is ready to jump on and really support a spring football league?
I actually think markets that you would expect NFL teams to do well in are most likely to be the places they should be putting these teams. I think we've seen this with St. Louis and San Antonio and DC, and I think maybe it doesn't work in New York the first time or Vegas, but I think you're more likely to get fans, say in other fans in Pittsburgh, when they already have a team to come out to a game than, in Topeka, but that's a whole other discussion, because, there are places like Salt Lake City that they want to try out, and places, obviously, Vegas is kind of just another team that Orlando is probably the place that they've tried a bunch of times. Birmingham is always seems to have a team in all of these spring leagues over the course of history, even dating back to the 80s USL iteration. And I think to an extent, Birmingham's been kind of middling, but good enough for one of these starting out leagues to do all right. It's an interesting question because, really, I think the first version of this XFL, they went to a lot of NFL towns, right? It was St. Louis, DC, Tampa, New York, Seattle, Dallas, Houston. And I think, this year we're seeing a lot of greater success in the places they've gone back to, and the places they've kind of picked out to be new with or not, outside of San Antonio, which I think has always had done a very good job of putting fans there, whether it was the AFL before this, which or the AAF or whatever it was. They had fans at those games. It's a fine line to walk, and I think they're going to be aggressive with how, especially in the XFL, how they relocate teams year to year. For example, I wouldn't be shocked if the way things are going with Vegas right now, if they decided to put that team in LA another year or something, because they're not in a position where they're locked in financially to these stadiums.
Okay, gotcha. And what about you, Sam? Similar question. Where do you think are the best markets for these teams, and if you could envision one popping up in a place that isn't necessarily there yet, that might be able to actually support it and hold it?
Yeah, Nick pretty much hit that on the head. A lot of these teams that they've revisited, yes, are thriving. St. Louis is doing insanely well, and DC has a pretty large fan base. But yeah, the Vegas Vipers, Orlando, they are not pulling any numbers, and the XFL is doing well in terms of viewership too, and so that kind of throws another factor into it, which is which teams are getting watched on TV, which teams are good enough for that, and the teams that really aren't are Orlando and Vegas. I wouldn't be surprised if because of that they ended up moving a team to one of those markets that have been kind of what
I think we lost your visual. You can keep talking. It might come back here in a second.
Okay. Yeah, so they've been looking for those experimental markets a lot. And I think, as he said, San Antonio is doing well, and that's kind of proof that they can stick another team in a large state. So they've been looking at bringing the team back to San Diego, from what I've heard. That's a market that, as much as, they didn't always show up, they want a team back. Salt Lake City's another one. There's a few, right? There's a few teams that you can even pick out a city and say, hey, it's a good idea. They've talked about putting a team in Canada because the original XFL, or the second XFL, sorry, was trying to actually partner with the CFL, which would have been interesting to see. And so because of that, there's so many options, right? And they're not tied down to any stadium. So it's a very free environment for them, which is good, how it should be for an experimental league.
Can I give a Canada spiel real quick?
Sure.
It's really hard for like a new league to do that, just because. Well, first of all, the NFL and the CFL have like an agreement where they can't put teams there because they know they dominate the markets if they immediately put a team. That might not be the case with the XFL, but this is a problem we kind of have seen in hockey and with the NFL trying to expand to other countries where currency is different, and it doesn't. It's just like it's difficult to like get players to sign contracts in a different country and then convert that, comparatively to like other teams in the United States, especially when like, economically, like Canada's a big economy, but it's not quite the United States.
Right. I mean, that does make sense. The Toronto Raptors are able to do it. So
yeah, I mean, there's like, there's versions of this, right? But there's a reason why baseball and well, first of all, there's a reason why the Expos left, right? And why a lot of hockey teams have left Canada as well. Hockey works in Canada because it's like the national sport, and so they have to have teams. That's their national league. But now you only have Toronto teams in hockey and basketball, and that's it. And part of that is that Toronto is just an extraordinarily strong market. Like I think people underrate how strong of a market that is.
It is a large city. It's cool to see with the XFL, at least, like they were getting more viewers than the NHL and the MLS, which are well-established leagues. I don't know whether to be disappointed as a hockey fan, or like if you're a soccer fan to be sad about that, or to be excited as a spring football fan. But there is a market, obviously, across the country, which is what that's showing. They got 1.5 million viewers to tune into the first game, week 1. And it's sort of dwindled off from there, but they're still averaging a lot of viewers. And so because of that, again, there's a large market almost everywhere across the country, especially for football. So it really depends on which of those cities are really starving for their own team to really gnash their teeth into.
Well, I think it's a reflection of, I think it's just a reflection of the nature of those leagues and how many games they play. Now, I think if you're going to put the championship games up against the Stanley Cup, or even potentially the championship for MLS, you may end up seeing those other leagues still overtake them in terms of viewership. But we get these games, once a week, just like the NFL. Those other leagues, you get how many games a week, how many games a season. No single game has nearly the impact on the season of that team that any single game does in any football league, whether it's college or pros. So those games mean a lot more. Now, I think once you get to the championships and the playoffs, we might see that change a little bit. But, only time will tell, and there is no doubt that football is king. So I'm curious to see if this popularity lasts in the interim, and once the draft heats up, we know what that's like on a national level, if that changes. And then we'll see, if they can kind of take up that space between the draft and when training camp starts, or if people are going to be all in on their draft picks and whatnot. But so I'm curious to see how it all shakes out. We'll definitely have you back on here, Sam, to kind of keep us updated on how those leagues are looking and how they're going. And, you never know when just like a major misstep financially is going to just evaporate a team completely. So we'll see. But Sam, thanks for joining. You are at Sam Goodman _18 on Twitter. Nick at Nick with Sports. Myself at the Max Dean. Shout out to No Ashley, our producer, at No Ashtray Sports. And of course, you can find Defiant Takes Football at Defiant Takes on all social media outlets. You can find all of our work written on defianttakesfootball.com. And we are live every Monday and Thursday here on the YouTube channel, and again, released on podcast feed as well. Last thing I'll mention is that you can find Nick and I doing our prospect breakdowns on the DTF film sessions here on the YouTube channel. We'll try and make it through the top 50. You can also find Kyron Samuels and I doing our brick wall breakdowns, looking at offensive linemen in the NFL. Guys, thank you for joining me, and we will see you all this Monday.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.